alaikum, everyone. Thanks for coming. Today, inshallah, we're going to be talking about somewhat uninspiring title, but something that I thought of last minute: environmental insights from Andalusi agriculture. So before we delve a little bit more into the title, which, as I said, is not very inspiring, let's talk a bit about myself, and hopefully I'm a bit more inspired. So my name is Hazim Asghari. I am from Morocco, grew up and lived in Morocco my whole life, really, up until this year where I moved to the UK, and I'm currently studying there for a PhD, looking at agriculture in Al-Andalus, particularly during the 11th century, and we'll come into that later. What brought me to do that was quite an interesting and somewhat funny story in my own understanding, and it's kind of relevant to some people in this room as well. I'm an environmentalist by training, so it kind of starts with being upset with how the world is and seeing the destruction of nature everywhere, and then thinking, things must be done differently, and maybe they were done differently in the past. All of these questions ultimately lead you to start learning about things on the alternative side of things, let's say, and you end up taking a course on permaculture soon after that, which I did. And being a Muslim by background and by conviction, I ended up kind of very soon after that coming across this thing of Muslims and their farming in the past. So naturally, as any good permaculturist should ask, I asked myself, well, surely the Muslims did it better than us in the past, and how did they do it differently? And maybe we can just take that and inform today's agriculture with that. So like I said, I soon kind of started moving in the circles in which the intersection of Muslim permaculturists kind of move. And very soon when you start doing that, what you come across is, next slide, the Filaha Texts project. So I came across the Filaha Texts project, and this was back in 2014, 15. And obviously didn't know anyone who was behind this page, and was just kind of asking myself this question: is this the equivalent of what we get from the kind of indigenous knowledge and the kind of books on how Native Americans used to do farming differently, or how the Mayas had a particular way of cropping three things together? So I was just asking myself, is this really the equivalent of an Islamic indigenous knowledge of nature? Never got the answer to that question, and I'm still working to get there. But what happened is that I met a couple people, people who kind of brought this to my knowledge. Probably the first one would be Ramis Kent, who was here 2 months ago, I believe, teaching a course on permaculture. And he kind of brought this to my knowledge, and soon after that, I met Sidi Uthman, who I must thank for organizing or helping to organize today's talk, but also for believing in my crazy ideas back in 2018 when I met him in Rabat, which led to him putting me in touch with Sidi Abu Qasim, who's not with us today, who also kind of believed in me enough to forward my contact to Sidi Karim Laham, who ended up writing my recommendation letter 2 years in a row until I managed to get funding to start this PhD. So 4 or 5 years later, after coming across this, I happened to be kind of, to my knowledge, the only person looking at going forward slightly deeper with some aspects of this project. I haven't come across another researcher interested in doing the same, so I'm a bit of a latecomer because this was mostly kind of dealt with in the 90s, 2000s, and I was kind of still in high school at that point. So now I'm just kind of trying to contribute a little bit to this, and my take is really to just include this in the canon or the official history of science, not from a perspective of Muslims were first, and Muslims came up with sustainable agriculture first, and before the Europeans did it, Muslims did it, and all of that. That's already been kind of dealt with, and I think there's enough coverage there. What I'm trying to say is, I think Muslims were very different in the 11th century, and maybe there's still some lessons for us, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, to learn from. And that kind of puts us in a slightly uncomfortable place, because not everything that is contained in these texts about agriculture, which I'll get to in a moment, is the kind of stuff which you think makes sense. So there's some witchcraft, if you want. There's some stories. There are some hadiths of the Prophet that are in no collections that are still extant. So extinct hadiths, if you want. And there are some stories which are kind of mind-boggling. So men on clouds, plows that go on their own, and fruits that speak different languages. Many things which, as you see, make answering the question very tricky. Next slide. So another important place that I also must extend my gratitude to is the Cortijo Az-Zahara, and obviously, very nice kind of new website, perfect background for my slides. I wish I could just use that in all my presentations, but I must thank them as well and everybody who takes part in the project, because my project was believed in before the university believed in me. So this is before I joined the PhD program. I was about to come here for a sort of extended research program for 3 months last year. And that didn't happen. And the rest is history, as you know, with COVID and all of that. But alhamdulillah, I feel very kind of privileged to have made it a year later. And that's something which is quite amazing to kind of also be in perfect sync with Sheikh's visit. So that's something I didn't plan, or we didn't plan, it just happened by mistake or by divine plan. And that's also, what I also want to say about the Azhara project is that it really is doing what I'm trying to, what I kind of thought should be done back when I got the first idea. And obviously, I'm very much of a latecomer again here. And Spiritual Ecology of Al-Andalus could have been the title of my PhD, but it's already taken, so I'll go for another one. But this is kind of what we're talking about. It's less about techniques, but more about the spirit side of things. So with that, next slide. And well, to jump in the topic, really, of what can we learn from agriculture in the 11th century Al-Andalus, we need to really kind of position ourselves in space and time. Why Al-Andalus and why 11th century? Al-Andalus, as all of you know, is where we are, or where, what was here before this modern nation state of Spain. And it was the kind of 900 years of Muslim presence on the Iberian Peninsula. This is the easiest definition that doesn't get anybody upset. And you can also call it the glorious time of Muslims in the medieval era, or other things, but we're talking about this big piece of land back when Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived here under some sort of Muslim rule. That's really the idea. The 11th century is the time where the Caliphate of Cordoba breaks down. So it's no longer about this centralized power dominated from the capital of Cordoba, but every region or city has their own ta'ifa, their own city-state, sometimes called petty states, because they kept fighting each other. And obviously there is a boundary that is being fought over with the northern Christian kingdoms, but this is not to say that it was Muslims versus Christians. A lot of alliances crossed over religion, so it was really just regional city-states and their interests. And at this time is kind of interesting for two reasons. Number one is it's a very disorganized time in political history, but for the history of agriculture, it's kind of a very interesting time, a time of almost innovation. This is kind of weird, but the moment you understand the mechanics behind it, it makes sense. What happens is that every court, every ta'ifa, if you want, had a court, a prince, and his scientists, his agronomists, which, due to the fact that the Christians kept attacking, had to all kind of start moving until they all found themselves in one of the most kind of prominent states, state of Seville. So instead of having one farmer scientist per place, we kind of now have 4 in one place. And that leads to collaboration and ideas meeting together, leading to kind of new ideas being born. And a lot of books are written in this time. A lot of these books of agriculture, termed the Filaha Texts, are from the 11th century, at least in my estimation, the most important ones. So it is a time of revolution, if you want, but it's also kind of just a time of restructuration. Boundaries are being changed constantly, but the science of Filaha is kind of exponentially increasing, if you want. The picture on the bottom is not directly related to what we're talking about, but it's kind of an inspirational picture. As you can see, this is the Alcázar of Seville. And you can see there's a kind of a neat line between the city and the gardens. And this is kind of what we're talking about. This division is obviously not how it was back then, but this is the world we live in. A very sharp distinction between humans and nature. Civilization and cultivated terrain and then wilderness. And that line is kind of, how do you negotiate that is the question I'm asking. Back in the 11th century, was that line the same? Was there more greenery in between those courtyards or no? I don't know yet, but that's the question we're asking. Excellent. The Filaha texts, I kept talking about them. What are they? They're texts of agriculture that do not just concern Al-Andalus, but the whole of the Muslim world. If you were to compile all of them together, you'd get a lot of stuff written from about the 10th century to the 18th century. So quite end of Ottoman period. The ones from Al-Andalus are about 12, and they span only the 10th to 14th century. So the last one is written in about 1392 or 1362. Most, obviously, these texts are in manuscript form. That's where they were written and copied. And before the printing press, people copied books by hand and distributed them. And it was very expensive because the nature of copying is very kind of slow and lengthy task. Plus, paper cost a lot of money. So we don't have a lot of manuscripts, but there's about 2 or 3 for each book available in different places in the world. A lot of them happen to be in Rabat in Morocco, Paris in France, and in Madrid in the Biblioteca del Escorial, if I am not wrong. There are a couple which are also in Granada, the School of Arabic Studies, Escuela de Estudios Árabes, but those are not really, it's not really a major center for storage. This is one from Iraq, and this is at the Oxford Library. And I had the chance to kind of deal with this one firsthand. And I put this picture in there just to give you an idea of what you get in these texts. So the content, again, like I said, can surprise some of us. So the Bab Dhikr Nakhl, or the chapter of mentioning the palm tree. And it talks about the reason for naming the palm tree in some cultures. Palm tree is called the sister of Adam, Ukhtu Adam. And it goes there and it talks about, how some people say that it is called the sister of Adam because apparently, let me actually just go and try to read 2 lines from it. منهم من قال إنما سميت أخت آدم لأنها لم تكن ولم تره إلا عند ولادة آدم. So apparently it did not exist or it did not see Adam until he was born, and therefore it's his sister. And anyway, it goes into like giving you one version of the story and the second version of the story, but it concludes by saying, and that's wrong. This is not true. So as you can see here, he says, وَمَا أَشْبَهَ ذَلِكَ, and whatever is similar to that, وَهُوَ كَذِبٌ مِثْلَ الْأَوَّلِ, and it is a lie just like the first one. So it's a very refreshing 10th century take on mythology and stories about plants. So just like today, there's a lot of lies that are floating around, and there are people who are critical enough to say, I know about this, but it's not true. So you deal with some of that, but some other aspects, they're not being challenged like that. So you'll see other things such as if you want your crop to not be infested with pests, then take a fox, skin it, and use the skin as a sieve, and sift your seeds in the fox's skin, and then plant them, and you should be fine. And there is no challenge of that method. So the books are, like I said, interesting to say the least. So in general, descriptive take on those texts would be that they deal with kind of like 5 to 4 chapters, depending on the book. Usually it's soil, sometimes water first, and then it talks about plants, and then propagation. So how do you propagate? Grafting, planting by seed, planting seedlings, cuttings, and all of that. And that's kind of very dry sometimes. So as to the olive tree, it needs this kind of soil, plant it in there, water it this many times per week, next chapter. As to the palm tree, these are these many types. As for this type, needs sandy soil, use some salt, add some ash, next chapter. And it keeps going like that, and there's literally no soul in it. It's very dry, very much like a recipe book. And, it's kind of that, it is what it is. But sometimes there's something that comes out and it says, And the best technique about doing that is something that we heard from the people of this place in Ronda, for example, and it says, and that has been tested and it works, but this following technique from the same place, it says, Wallahu a'lam, and God knows. So it's kind of like telling you, there is something special about this, but it's not really 100% kind of giving you the secrets. So these texts have been analyzed since since colonialism, but effectively in a serious way. It was mostly the CSIC in Spain, the Consejo Superior de Investigaciones Científicas, that has done a lot of work on this. And the analysis was mostly like what kind of plants are mentioned in there, what kind of tools are mentioned in there, what kind of regions, what kind of, very descriptive analysis, nothing about spiritual meanings, worldview, or anything of that. So this is where Hazm comes in, and I pretend to tell everybody else that has looked at this before me that you missed something quite important. But I'll have the answer in 3 years' time. So for now, this is an attempt. Next slide. And just to show you the kind of manuscripts I have to deal with, which is quite different from the first one, which is quite nice looking. This is one of the ones that I am looking at, and thank God that this has already been edited and published in a readable version. But as you can see, the one in Oxford is pretty nice and it still retains the red color of the chapters. This one is completely waterlogged and eaten by worms. And we only have a black and white scan, thanks to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, who is also kind of not willing to give anybody physical access to this, understandably so, because I'm sure anybody's sweat just on the palm of hands could destroy the rest of this. So there's about 300 folios of this kind just for this one book, and this is a summary. And this is the other problem that I'm dealing with, is that a lot of these books that I'm looking at, 4 out of the 12 that belong to Al-Andalus, half of them are missing, sometimes a chapter is missing, and sometimes the introduction, which is the most important part, is completely missing. Next slide. So to zoom in on my particular take or my particular interest, I'll be looking at 4 people only, and that's kind of a little bit too ambitious. If you follow the collapse of Cordoba, and we can start in the beginning there, in the center, you have a Zahrawi who is very famous, also known as Abul Qasim Zahrawi. He's famous usually as a surgeon, somebody who developed a lot of surgical tools for eye surgery, for cataract and all of that. And if you go to Cordoba, there's a lot of talk of Zahrawi and how he's kind of the first Muslim scientist and all of that. He also wrote on agriculture a book which is available in manuscript form but hasn't been published yet. It's the only one of all of these that hasn't been published yet. So apparently he's the teacher of this very important agronomist also called Ibn Wafid, who journeys to Toledo and becomes the main court scientist or the main court agronomist in Toledo. After Toledo falls, Ibn Wafid disappears. We don't really know what happens to him. Probably dies. But his student Ibn Bassal, the son of the onion planter, if you want, Bassal, right, goes to Seville and becomes kind of the main dog in town. And Ibn Bassal kind of adopts 3 students, Ibn Hajjaj, Abul Khair, and Al-Tighnari. Al-Tighnari is interesting because he's from the region of Granada, apparently from a place that no longer exists called Tirnar. And he did a short stint in Almeria, but ended up in Seville. And this is the guy that we'll be looking at today, particularly the introduction to his book, because out of these 4, he's the only one who has an introduction still available. And the others, kind of all the books have lost their introduction. This is not the manuscript I'm looking at. This is just a very nice picture from a very famous history book written by Al-Biruni, Persian scientist and astronomer. It's called The Chronology of Ancient Nations. And this is a page about Ad-Dawla al-Abbasiyya, the Abbasids, and it talks about the birth of the Abbasids, according to Al-Biruni. But then the illustration is what matters there. And you have 2 men, one of them engaged in digging a hole to plant something, most likely, with some citrus trees in the background, some clouds, and someone who looks like a saintly man on the left. Both of them have those halos behind their heads, which I think does communicate something. I'm not too sure. There's no reference to that illustration in the text, but let's just stay with it and use it as a kind of background to our discussion. And I'm sorry if this is not the best way to illustrate this, because it's from a completely different era, but you see what I mean. So Tighnari's prologue, or the introduction of his text, is written in the early 12th century. So this is someone who lived in the 11th, but only managed to kind of write down his thoughts in the 12th century, which shouldn't be an issue, but for us historians it becomes problematic because my PhD is only doing the 11th century, and one of these texts are actually beyond the 11th century. Supervisors don't like that, but you guys are fine with that, I hope. Less of half the work survives, and it's a very interesting introduction, which is about 60 pages. And I wish I could do it justice, but let's just say that it's an introduction that even if you're not interested in agriculture at all, would make you suddenly very interested in doing agriculture, almost to save your life in akhirah. So the way it goes is that it says that Filaha, or agriculture, is the best occupation in society. This is the first statement of the introduction. It says that in it is the biggest rizq, so the biggest provision, the biggest ajr, the biggest reward, and also the least problems. And that's tricky because farmers know that that's not true. So obviously Tighnari will go and explain what kind of problems, and obviously what he means is spiritual problems, but he won't say that until like page 59, which is one before last. Tighnari is interesting because he has some sort of an ethical framework, if you want. He says that Filaha, most people think it's a way to make a living, you eat from it, you sell the surplus, make some money, family's happy, and society moves on. He says that this couldn't be further from the truth, and he says that Filaha is all about rights. So he says that huquq, you have to give everything its right. The land's right is to be plowed, according to him. So you have to plow the land, because otherwise you didn't give it its due right. And the one who gives right in this case is the fallah, the farmer. The human being who is a steward of God is very responsible and is the one who, if you want, has the obligation to do so, will be rewarded if he does, but will be punished if he doesn't. So it's very much of a no-joke situation. You have to plow the land because the land's right is to be plowed. Not all the land, just the land that's available for food to be grown in. The right of the animals is to eat part of your harvest. So they're quite explicitly mentioned, from the worms all the way to the birds that eat your fruits. It's mentioned that not only shouldn't you be upset about losing part of your crop to insects and birds and all sorts of burrowers and rats, mice, but in fact that's part of the purpose. You are growing crops so that other animals can eat, because making a living as an animal in a landscape which is, I'm guessing, dry like the Mediterranean landscape is quite hard for an animal as well. So it's also part of your job to feed other animals. And we haven't gotten to human beings yet. Then he goes into the right of the trees, and he says that each tree has a right to water, has a right to manure, and the right to wind. And this is where he's going to diverge with some of the other authors. So he says you should plant trees on a straight line so that each one of them doesn't block the wind from the other, and therefore each one of them gets their fair share of wind and air. So others will say that you should plant trees in a kind of jumbled fashion so that you act as a windbreak. But he will say that they need their fair share of wind. So you see that the technical differences abound, but the spiritual vision, if you want, or the ethical framework is quite the same with many other authors. Then he talks about the rights of the rest of the population. The farmer is last. So the rest of the population's right is to eat your crop, whether it's sold, whether it's given as charity, but you have a right to actually have a successful crop every year so that society can eat, so that the market is full. So it's really an obligation situation there as well. And that's something that you don't really see in other treatises on farming at the time in different societies. So just to have something to compare it to, if you look at the manuals of the Romans before the Andalusians on agriculture, you don't have this idea of rights. You have this idea of this is how to do things best, and this is the techniques that we have tried. But these guys, the Muslims who live in Al-Andalus, they add this kind of twist on it. It's like, yes, the technical aspect is important, but without the ethics, kind of falls apart. Intentions is another big thing in there, and this is something that we'll use that nice illustration for. So for those who attended the tour, if you remember, I talked of a story where a farmer and his apprentice are working in a field, and a man descends. This is the night of Arafah, or the day of Arafah, the day before Eid. A man descends from the clouds, on a cloud as well, and talks to the farmer in some sort of language that is not understood by the apprentice. The farmer keeps saying, no, I can't, no, I can't. The apprentice goes later on to the farmer, says, who was the man in the cloud? Who was so-and-so? And he says, this is the bedel of this region, I guess if you want, kind of a big saint of this place, just to make things simple. And obviously the apprentice is bewildered that the farmer said no to a person of that stature. And he says, so why did you refuse his offer, whatever it was? And the farmer says, well, he asked me to go with him to Arafah to stand in prayer for that night. And I said no, because I made an intention to plow the field today or tonight. And therefore, I don't want to be part of the people that God described in the Quran by saying, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu lima taquluna ma la taf'alun. Oh, you who believe, why do you say what you do not do? And he said that he didn't want to be part of that. So intentions, quite a big thing. And this text or this intro is telling you quite directly, if your intentions are not good, then forget a good harvest. And if you still manage to get a harvest, then you won't be getting the barakah or the blessing from doing so. And you won't reach this concept which was introduced of Filaha being the best occupation in society. It's only the best if you do all of these things. The other thing that he throws in there, which is quite material, quite an interesting critique of the economic take on farming, like we grow crops to make money and eat, he says that you shouldn't expect a harvest at all. In fact, he kind of goes, like the longest section in the prologue is just about that. He calls it istishraf, or expecting the benefits, expecting the material benefits of the harvest. He's like, you should just do what needs to be done, and the rest is in God's hands. And basically, he says, if you get a failed crop, then good for you, you got the reward for the intentions. If you got a crop on top of that, and no bad harvest happened, then you also get the extra benefit of being able to make a living. But the point is, if you expected that, in both situations you missed on the barakah. Because in the first case, you'll just be upset. And in the second, you'll be basically just getting the material benefit. And he's saying that if you expect a good harvest or some sort of income from farming, you're not doing farming per se, you're just doing some basic sort of buying and selling, which, according to the way he mentions it, is below the occupation of farming. So it's interesting that here there's kind of this comparison between jobs in society, and the farmer is kind of really at the top. While today we really think of the farmer really at the bottom of the food chain, right? In a way, kind of brings it up. So the thing you get from this prologue, which sadly enough so far is only available in Arabic in printed form. The book is published by the CSIC, the Consejo that I mentioned earlier, and it's called in Spanish El Recreo de las Mentes No, it's called El Esplendor del Jardín, El Recreo de las Mentes. So it's the flower of the garden and the recreation of the mind, if you want. Zuhrat al-Bustan or Zahrat al-Bustan wa Nuzhat al-Adhan. And as you know, Muslims back then and still today love these titles that rhyme. So it's a playing on those words of beauty in the garden, but also the mind aspect is there. So recreation for the mind is kind of your hint to the spiritual aspect of doing that. Before a translation is available, which I hope to someday contribute to, I just want to kind of summarize the prologue by saying that if you were to publish it in English and make it into a treatise of like Introduction to Farming 101, it would end up not being that. It would end up being rather some sort of article on the relationship between technology, work, time, and comfort. Because all he's talking about in there is that your technology is based on your intention. So you can see a plow in front of you, but if you plow with one intention or the other, you get two different outcomes. So it doesn't matter how the plow is. And then he talks about work, and he says that the harder you work, the more benefit there is, and therefore this idea of laziness is really frowned upon, which goes immediately to the idea of time. And he talks about having free time and leisure time, and you shouldn't really rely on that because whatever time you have left should be reinvested in the farming. And the last thing he's hinting at is this idea of comfort or mental comfort. Good intentions, responsibility towards the creation, the rights of creation, and also no expectations. A very uncomfortable place to be if you want to have any ounce of predictability. So he's basically asking you to be a saint in a shorthand, and also to kind of deal with very material things and getting your hands dirty quite literally. So that's kind of just a thought on how different the introduction is to the rest of the book. The rest of the book is a recipe book, which is dry, and it just talks about, if you want to mix manures, this is the manure of the donkey, and it should be rested for 2 years. The manure of the horse should be rested for 3 years, and you cannot use manure from ducks because it's the worst manure of all, and don't even think about the manure coming from pigs. But the introduction has none of that. It's literally just a philosophical article, if you want. And that's kind of why I'm interested in doing something about this prologue. So far, there is, believe it or not, only one article written on this prologue. And I don't know why nobody else has looked into this. And the only one article that's written on it actually talks about the fiqh references that are inside this prologue, because he talks a lot about how people cheat others when they do farming together. This is on the section on intentions. And he's like, you should rent the land, according to the Shafi'i school. You can only do it with what comes out of the land. According to the other school, that you can only rent the land so that the person can pay you back in something that's food. And he mentions these kind of fiqh debates at the time. And he says that what's important is that you don't have the intention to cheat somebody or the intention to take more than what came out that year by deciding before the harvest. So you can only decide the price of renting after the harvest because you don't know if it's going to be a good year or a bad year. So there's a lot of fiqh references in there. But, that's kind of what gets the Western academics going. It's like, Islamic law and early treatises of agriculture. But I'm more interested into aspects of worldview because I'm somewhat of an environmentalist. So hopefully something will come out, and you sure will be the first people to read that if I ever get to write on it. Next slide. Something else that was floating at the time.
Just one
yes.
question. Sorry. The Spanish edition is, how would you judge it?
It's not a Spanish edition, it's the Arabic edition with a Spanish introduction. So it's a Spanish researcher who did the edition of all the Arabic manuscripts and published it. Uh-huh. It's the only edition available. So,
but all the content you said, it is all in the introduction.
No, so the introduction is not the introduction of the book which is translated. It's just the researcher's introduction. It's just saying like this is a book from the 11th century and this is important. But the rest of the book is just in Arabic. It's about 360 pages. So I think it will take a few years before anyone translates it, if there is a project which is interested to translate it. But so far, nothing. And this book was published in 2006. So up till now, 14 years or 15, there hasn't been any progress on that front. But keep making dua, maybe I'll do it. Something else that has been translated, and I think all of you who can get this book should get it, is a 10th century book, which is, in my estimation, quite crazy. It's a story about animals and mankind going to court with the king of the jinn. And the animals are taking humans into court. They're suing humans for their mistreatment. And this is quite revolutionary because if you read it, you think it's a treatise of animal cruelty written by a 1960s activist. It's literally from the 10th century, and it's written by the very enigmatic Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity, which are completely anonymous. Nobody knows who they are. There are some guesses that they are people who lived in 9th century Iran, but that's kind of really the best guess. all we can say is that those people are really inclined to philosophical debates. And this story is about 10 or 12 chapters, and it's about basically animals complaining to the king of the jinn, saying that humans, they kill us for food, they mistreat us, they use us as beasts of burden, they don't feed us well, they capture us from the forest, they make us breed forcefully, all the stuff you can imagine. They don't slaughter us properly, they eat too much meat, and they are not worthy of having this right to enslave us. And the people who are represented every time by a different nationality in every chapter, so like a man from Iraq, a man from Syria, a man from North Africa, they come and they make an argument and they say, no, God has given us the right to use the animals for everything, and the Quran says so, and the Hadith says so, and there's a proof that the prophets were shepherds and they had the right to use animals. And the next chapter, the animals will come and quote from the Quran and from the Hadith and say that human beings do terrible things and they don't deserve this right to manage animals. The last chapter is the most interesting chapter, obviously. It's the resolution. And there comes a man without a nationality who apparently is going to resolve it all. Again, some sort of a saint if you want. And he makes the argument that human beings have the right to use other creatures or to take benefit from other creatures because it's the only creature on earth that is capable of remembrance. And it kind of really cuts it there. And the animals suddenly agree and they say true. And then the man also says it's also the only species or the only creature that has brought forward prophets and saints and all these kind of amazing people. And the animals agree, and the story kind of finishes there, leaving you with some sort of thought that it's only the people who have the aspiration to become saintly and want to act like prophets and like saints, only those people have the right to deal with animals or to actually take benefit from them. And then it's accepted, not that you torture them, but that you have the right to take them under your command. So it's kind of a nice reminder, again, 10th century, brilliant.
Is this translated from Persian?
This is translated from Persian, indeed.
Right.
And
what's the king of the jinn say?
so the king of the jinn is an interesting figure. He's quite invisible. He says, after every end of chapter, he says, I have heard your argument, and indeed this is true, but let's hear from the other side. And at the last chapter, he says, well, you seem to have agreed, so I will kind of let this case be closed. He's really just an MC, if you want, a moderator. So this novel is kind of also floating at that time. And this kind of brings me to my conclusion, so I don't go too long, which is, how do we bring all of this to kind of some sort of meaningful takeaway for today? And I think the idea there is that an Islamic environmentalism is not necessarily, the easiest thing on earth. To be a Muslim and an environmentalist, sometimes there are some contradictions that you have to deal with. One of them is how plastic saves the cutting down of trees, and another one may be how GMO crops are more drought resistant than hybrid traditional varieties. So there's a lot of things which a Muslim might not necessarily agree with the environmental movement. And how about doing or building Islamic environmentalism based on something else, something like an 11th century ethic of Filaha? So that's kind of where I'm trying to go. And this quote can kind of illustrate my point. So this is Masanobu Fukuoka. He's really a kind of a Japanese permaculturist of sorts. He is one of the inspirations of the permaculture movement. He's dead now, but he's written a book which is quite famous called The One Straw Revolution. And he says that the ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. Something that can also be translated as the cultivation and perfection of human hearts. So this is kind of what we're trying to get at. You're really sowing your seeds, but what you're doing at the end of the day is you're improving your own self to become this saintly creature who has the right to do so. It's kind of a virtuous circle, not a vicious one. The second idea we can take away from all of this is that taqwa brings about tawfiq. And this is an idea that I heard first from Hamza Yusuf. And I think it makes sense, and it's a nice alliteration, T. Taqwa tawfiq. God consciousness leads you to success. Plowing with a good intention leads you to a successful harvest. Plowing with a bad intention might lead you to a successful harvest, but without the blessing. And that's not success, right? As we understand it. The use of nature is an option to those with saintly inspirations, or aspirations actually, only. And that means also that if you want to be doing some sort of sustainable, environmentally inclined agriculture, you have to be on a path to something else, not to the crop, not to the harvest, not to the fruits, but something slightly beyond, perfection of the human being. And before debating, which is another important point, because everybody who comes across my research asks me, okay, what can we learn practically from this? I say, nothing, because it's not the time to learn the practical stuff. Before debating which techniques are best for growing crops, which techniques are best for composting, manure, the first thing we do is with that new understanding of our position as a farmer, is we should open new doors in our relationship to the crop, nature, trees, animals. Only then, with these new ideas, can we kind of develop a new technology. Capital T, taqwa, tawfiq, all those T's are in there. So that would be the equivalent of someone who's never dealt with dogs and suddenly after reading a book becomes a dog whisperer. You cannot know what the dog is capable of until you kind of engage with the dog or a cat in a different manner than just feeding it outside and kicking it with the foot when it bothers you. When you open the door of trying to see if the dog or the cat has feelings, you start dealing with them differently. And only then can someone say, well, there's this particular thing you can do with your dog which can lead to X, Y, and Z. But if you think that dog is just an animal that eats and also kind of dirties the streets, then your understanding of it doesn't allow for anything beyond that. So the first step is really get into that, what is a tree? Is it just a resource to be exploited? Is it just a crop that needs to be harvested, made into something, and then sold in the market? Or is it a sabab, right? A cause for improving yourself. This is a term that I borrow from the prologue as well, where the author says that agriculture is not only the best occupation, but it is the best of asbab, the best of these things on earth that you can take as almost tools for improvement on a spiritual kind of path, or as kind of things you have to take as opportunities for religious improvement. So, one more. The last question to end with, because I don't have answers yet, is to ask ourselves, is agriculture a responsible co-creation of life with God? It's like you're creating life, but obviously you're not the creator. You're in the image of God as a smaller kind of creation. Are you helping create new crops every season? Are you helping create new fruits? Are you helping breed animals in a responsible manner with God's vision? Or are you just doing that for yourself? And if this becomes a new definition of Filaha, I'll be very happy. But the idea is really, until we answer that question, all the practical stuff is really, second-hand. It's second to all of this. And maybe we should just end here and take any questions. And thank you very much for listening. Questions, any comments, any something that wasn't clear? Yes?
You should tell them what Sheikh said to you at lunch about plants.
Yeah, that's a good one. So I was talking with Sheikh Muhammad 2 days ago over lunchtime, and I suggested to him the idea, or what he thinks of the idea, that human beings are tougher to deal with than plants and animals. And that was kind of me explaining why I like agriculture, because it's easier to deal with plants and animals than with human beings, who are very complex. And he said to that of course, it makes sense, because plants and animals have a smaller ego than human beings. Smaller nefs. And he said that's why. And then we proceeded to talk about how the human being's ego is also partly that of plants and animals. So we talked about how, for example, some animals represent the snake in us, or the cat in us, or the monkey in us. And he said, particularly with the snake, with the cats and monkeys, they're very much concerned with their personal gains and benefits. So that was his take, and I think that's kind of an interesting way to bring back this relationship. We are made of nature, in a kind of psychological sense, as much as we are more complex than it, in that we can do things such as disobey, use completely destructive tools for farming when animals are really unable to do so.
This point of the hukuk of the land is something which is very much felt. I don't know personally, but also people around. When you have something, I mean, you say I'm happy I have a little bit of land. I'm worried because now I have to give the right to every single thing there. So it's a burden finally. It's not
exactly.
No?
It's an ethical burden almost.
It's a blessing, but in the end, it is. If there is a tree and I'm not collecting the fruit in time, there's something in my nature which says it's not correct, and all people are around, you know? But it's so difficult nowadays.
Yeah.
So difficult nowadays.
Well, I guess
the Quincy, they are just gone, you know. I looked at them 2 days ago and now they are gone. They are always, I brought the box in the net on Friday, but now they are already gone. I mean,
there is
They went past
I don't know, it's so quickly the nature.
there is a technique from one of the books, which is not on the practical side, or maybe can benefit you. There's a technique described in one of the books that talks about fruits falling.
Yes.
And it's something which is quite interesting. I didn't find it in any other book, but this guy talks about pear trees. Ijas, right? Spanish? Pears? Peras. And he says that if you want to avoid the fruits dropping, you can take a piece of paper and write Ya Qabid. Ya Qabida kulli shay. Oh, the one who keeps everything in its place. And he said you hang it on every fruit. So it's... Sorry?
The kaki trees is a little difficult.
You have to try that, see if it works. There's sometimes very practical advice, and he says, وَهُوَ مُجَرَّب, and this is tested. So there's no doubt. It's not even something, Wallahu a'lam. It's like mujarrab, tested. Thank you. Yeah? One more?
Yeah, I did have a question. I found it very interesting when you were describing what the prologue and its philosophical nature, and then how he was describing as the work of being doing agriculture is kind of the highest way of serving in this life and also for akhirah. And then I was wondering, like when you mentioned like intention or expectations, if given that it's not realistic for all of us to suddenly become farmers, or maybe also not good because there's a lot of input perhaps, if that could be distilled in a kind of more general way, that it could be like principles for any work that you do. If you follow them, then you would serve your work in the most. Wait, I wonder if they could be like generalized to not only farmers, but any work that we do these days.
I think if you take the prologue and replace farming with anything, it does work. Because like I said, it's really just about blessing, time, work, and responsibility. It goes around these topics, and it doesn't really talk about farming, except when it comes to particular stories, like someone plowing their field. But I think it could be applied anywhere else. There's one thing where he mentions that actually might be related to your question. He says that not everybody can do agriculture. And he says that you should feel privileged that you are doing so, and you should make the intention of fardul kifaya, of this idea of an obligation that if one person does, you have taken care of the obligation for the whole community. Just like making the adhan, there's only one person that needs to do that. He says that you should count yourself as the people who have taken care of farming for the rest of people who can't do it. So it's also there. Yes?
I just wanted to ask about the whether or not leaving land wild, how that fits in with the scheme of things, intentionally.
That is one of the trickiest aspects of this, because I've been looking at trying to decipher these authors' perception of wilderness, of uncultivated nature. And sometimes you find a very negative take. It's like they compare it to, sometimes very crude comparisons, like a woman that cannot give kids, something like that, infertile land. Sometimes they talk about it as useless land or dangerous land. But in other aspects, in other books, in other texts, you find the reference to land which is not cultivated in one of two lights. There's one which is, it's a place to go observe. So a lot of these texts make reference to, if you want to grow something, go to the forest near you and see what kind of soil grows under it and replicate the same conditions. So it's like a place to go and observe. Or the other thing is, they say, if you see a land that is within the city's vicinity and it's not planted, then take over it and reclaim it and revive it. And the law at the time also meant that if you reclaimed the land and revived it, it became yours. So they either talk about it as a place that there's nothing growing on it and it can be revived, or there is stuff growing in it and you should be used as some sort of observation ground, just to go and see how things work.
But also, isn't it like Allah has made that, it's only by His grace that thing is growing there, and He,
That's kind of the implicit message. It's kind of like the wild, uncultivated forest is very complex, it's impossible to take a predictable output from, because it's obeying different laws. It's kind of God's maintaining that. God is the farmer there. You're the farmer in your land, which is a dumbed down version. It's got 2 or 3 crops, maybe 4 or 5, maybe 20, but not an infinite number, and also a very predictable seasonal amount. So every season there's this crop, and he's implicitly, and this is what I'm trying to get to, maybe next 3 months, writing something about this. This idea that we can get to an understanding of wilderness as the more complex version of what we're trying to emulate. So farming then becomes a simplification of God's work, but it's also an imitation of God's work. In that sense, that's where the blessing comes from. Doing God's work on earth, whether it's giving charity or planting things so that animals and human beings can eat. Yeah.
In the manuscripts that you've looked at, do they talk about commons, the commons?
They do, and this is something I haven't looked at yet in detail, but hopefully I can do that this coming year, because I have to talk about the legal aspects of land ownership. There is some element of kind of laissez-faire, which is like everybody should take their right, and the responsibility is on the person managing the turns of people, whether it's a pasture that's grazed by different people, or it's a land that is used to grow some kind of herbs, usually how it is. The examples of Morocco of fields that are commons, which are just lavender and nothing else. But I don't have much else to say about that.
At the beginning, you mentioned like three ajaib, 3 extraordinary things. I don't remember exactly. Now I kept that one of the Abdal coming and asking to come to pray. What were the other 2?
Well, the one other is this one about the dua on the fruits and how it's tested and it works. And the other one was about, I can't remember, but it has to do with plowing and animals. I think it's
plowing on his own, you said something like this.
I think it's the animals taking the plow on its own. I can't remember exactly. But if I find it, I'll...
Wasn't it Adam's coming with a plow?
There is that, and that's kind of the origin story of agriculture, is that Adam came down from heaven, where he could eat freely. But once he came down to earth, he was given a plow by God, and it was told, the only way you can eat now is if you do farming, because the days of eating without working are over. On earth, you need to work. So this is given as one of the stories which explain the origin of agriculture, and there's no idea of debates there. It's the official history of agriculture is that the moment human beings came down, the plow was there already. So it's not invented in 10,000 BC, it was there since day one.
And you also mentioned something, fruits speaking different languages.
That one also, my memory is not very good now, but...
it was a teaser, now we want the...
You have to wait till the second version of this talk. Hopefully I get the references down. But there is something about fruits giving you feedback.
Feedback?
Yeah.
Fruit has its own language.
Yes.
I think that's what it must be. But there's an idea of like when you do something wrong and you have the right readiness, you can hear the tree telling you, no, it's not like that, it's like that.
So they don't speak of hunting and gathering communities that preceded agriculture?
Not in these books that I've seen, no. But again, every time I reread them, I find other things, so I wouldn't make a final statement.
We'll do another talk
Inshallah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for listening. For your time.